Millionaire husband flirts with mistress. On phone, pregnant wife's cold reaction leaves him in regret. Welcome to the turbulent world of Jonathan White, a self-made millionaire whose life seems perfect on the surface: fancy cars, a palatial home, and a stunning wife named Hannah, who is pregnant with their first child. Yet behind the facade of success lies a web of secrecy and heartbreak. In a single phone call, Jonathan's flirtation with his young mistress sets off a chain reaction he never saw coming. Hannah's cold, unwavering response to his betrayal will leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about love and loyalty. Prepare for an emotional rollercoaster packed with shocking twists, untold secrets, and unexpected redemption. Jonathan White was not born into wealth. He built his fortune painstakingly over the years, inch by inch, starting with a small tech startup called Futurelight Innovations. With relentless ambition and a flair for negotiation, he maneuvered through the competitive world of corporate acquisitions. By the time he was 30, he had made his first $1 million. 10 years later, his empire had expanded to real estate, software patents, and a lucrative chain of gyms. People whispered about his uncanny business instincts, and journalists wrote articles praising his rags to riches story. At home in a sprawling estate in the outskirts of New York, Jonathan lived with his wife, Hannah White. Hannah had grown up in a middle-class family in Queens, raised by her single mother, Angela Castillo. Her upbringing was humble, but her spirit fierce. She had met Jonathan by chance at a charity gala, where she served as an organizer. Their connection was instantaneous, one of those whirlwind romances that never fails to captivate. After a year of intense courtship, they married in a small ceremony. Hannah had insisted that their union feel intimate and authentic rather than lavishly grand. Jonathan, smitten by her kindness and no-nonsense attitude, agreed without hesitation. Over the next couple of years, they dreamed about building a family. When Hannah became pregnant, the couple was overjoyed. They told everyone, family, friends, and even business associates. Life felt perfect. Still, beneath this rosy surface, Jonathan carried silent burdens. Though the public saw him as a success story, he wrestled with the fear that everything could be taken away in an instant. His father, Robert White, had once warned him how fleeting fortune could be. As a result, Jonathan worked long hours, sometimes traveling to Europe or Asia at the drop of a hat. The distance created gaps between him and Hannah, gaps that grew steadily. While Hannah tried to adapt to pregnancy's emotional highs and lows, Jonathan's nerves were frayed from overseas negotiations and constant business calls. The more exhausted he became, the more he craved novelty and excitement, a dangerous hunger that invited temptation. It was during a networking event at the posh Delmont Hotel that Jonathan met Isabella Johnson, a striking woman in her late 20s, with golden hair and captivating emerald eyes. Isabella was a freelance consultant hired by one of Jonathan's close colleagues, James Nicholson, to facilitate a merger. She exuded the confidence of someone who had navigated boardrooms all her life. Their first conversation began innocently enough, talk about software investments and the shifting tech landscape, but the spark between them was undeniable. Each time they encountered each other in subsequent meetings, the conversation grew more personal. Soon they started sharing private jokes and exchanging texts late into the night. Jonathan told himself it was just harmless flirting, a playful respite from his exhausting routine. But the line between professional rapport and emotional entanglement blurred faster than either expected. Isabella had a magnetic pull, and Jonathan, despite the love for his wife, found himself drawn to her. The guilt gnawed at him from the inside, but a more powerful urge to escape his mounting anxieties pushed him further. At first, Hannah was too focused on her pregnancy to notice the subtle changes in Jonathan's behavior. She assumed his distance stemmed from overwork. Yet there were small tells: the way he guarded his phone, his sudden silence when she entered the room, and the fleeting panic in his eyes if she caught a glimpse of the screen. As Hannah's belly grew, so did Jonathan's secret. Late-night phone calls became a routine. Text messages turned heated. And soon, one act of indiscretion would alter the course of his entire life. A single phone call from Isabella that Hannah would accidentally overhear. When the clock struck midnight on a brisk January evening, Jonathan's phone vibrated. Hannah stood by the doorway, heart pounding, as she heard giggles and hushed flirtations, words that stabbed at her soul. It was the beginning of a betrayal she never imagined, and her reaction would startle everyone, including Jonathan himself. Hannah's hand trembled as she leaned against the doorway leading into the dimly lit living room. She'd been heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when she heard Jonathan's low voice on the phone, punctuated by Isabella's playful laughter. Suspicion tightened around her heart. Usually, Hannah might have rushed in, confronted Jonathan, demanded an explanation. But she was pregnant, both physically drained and emotionally cautious. She needed to protect herself and her unborn child. Instead of making a scene, she turned quietly on her heel and went back upstairs, silently trembling. It was then she remembered what her mother, Angela, had told her about heartbreak years ago. The moment you feel betrayal, remember that confronting someone in anger is rarely productive. Observe, gather your strength, and decide your next steps with a calm mind. Hannah never thought she would need this advice in her own marriage. In the days that followed, Jonathan sensed a chill from Hannah. She became quieter, her responses succinct, her eyes distant. He wondered if it was simply the rigors of pregnancy or something else. Whenever he tried to reach out, she would offer a small, polite smile and say she was tired. His internal alarm bells rang, but he forced himself to dismiss them. After all, he had everything under control. He was sure Hannah couldn't possibly know. He continued to see Isabella. Sometimes they met for lunch at boutique cafes in downtown Manhattan. Other times they extended their business discussions at James Nicholson's office. The more time he spent with her, the more dangerously enthralled he became. It wasn't solely physical attraction. Isabella provided an intoxicating thrill. She made him forget the responsibilities and anxieties waiting at home. But Hannah was not as naive as Jonathan assumed. She quietly began to piece together the timeline of his behavior. She noticed how Jonathan's attention was always pinned to his phone at certain hours. She recognized the anxious flickers in his eyes whenever she walked into a room while he texted. She even found a receipt from an upscale restaurant, Delphine's, dated a week prior, indicating a two-person dinner at a time Jonathan had claimed to be working late at the office. Still, Hannah's reaction was not fiery or impulsive. She carried herself with an eerie composure, a calm that unnerved Jonathan. Whenever he invited her to talk about the nursery or the upcoming baby shower, she would nod, but her face remained unreadable. Occasionally, she would rest her hand protectively on her baby bump, as though drawing strength from the life growing within her. One evening, Jonathan proposed they hire an interior designer for the baby's nursery. Normally, Hannah would have been excited, rummaging through color palettes and discussing furniture styles. This time, she merely answered in a monotone, "Do whatever you think is best." A tension-laced silence filled the room. Jonathan's frustration surfaced, though he tried not to show it. He pressed her lightly. "Hannah, I want you to be happy about this. We're having a baby. Isn't this what we always wanted?" Hannah looked at him with a penetrating gaze. "Yes, it is," she said softly. "But sometimes what we want becomes complicated." He was left speechless, uncertain how to interpret her cryptic reply. A nervous dread started coursing through him. He recalled an incident from his childhood, seeing his father cheat on his mother. The cold front his mother displayed toward his father had eventually escalated into an ugly divorce. Could history be repeating itself? That night, after Hannah had gone to bed, Jonathan found himself staring at his wedding photograph on the mantel. He thought about Hannah's unwavering support through his toughest years, launching future light innovations, dealing with difficult clients, even comforting him when his father passed away. She had been a pillar of strength. He pulled out his phone, searching for a sense of relief or companionship in Isabella's number. As it rang, images of Hannah flickered in his mind, unbidden. When Isabella answered, her voice laced with anticipation, Jonathan forced himself to speak casually. But deep down, guilt burned. He ended the call quickly, citing exhaustion. Something had changed in him, even if he couldn't admit it yet. For the first time, he questioned if the fleeting excitement with Isabella was worth endangering the life he and Hannah had built. What if he lost Hannah forever? The next morning, Hannah awoke earlier than usual. She made herself a cup of herbal tea and wandered out to the garden. Dawn light cast a warm glow across the neatly trimmed hedges. She ran her hand across her belly, whispering, "I will protect you." The vow was as much for her unborn child as it was for her own heart. She sensed the storm brewing, but she had decided she would not confront Jonathan with rage. Instead, she would let him unravel his own deception while she plotted her next move carefully. The phone on Jonathan's desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He'd been staring at financial projections on his computer screen, but his mind kept drifting to Hannah's icy demeanor and the swirl of guilt taking root in his heart. "Jonathan?" The voice was instantly recognizable, Isabella. Even over the phone, her tone radiated confidence. "James Nicholson and I want to discuss the next phase of the merger. Can you meet us at Delmont Hotel at 5? Jonathan glanced at the wall clock. It was already 3 in the afternoon. Sighing, he agreed. Despite his internal conflict, duty called. Business was the one arena where he felt certain, in control. At 5 sharp, Jonathan entered the opulent lobby of the Delmont Hotel. James Nicholson, a middle-aged man with greying hair, greeted him with a firm handshake. Isabella stood nearby, wearing a fitted navy dress and an air of self-assurance that was impossible to ignore. She beamed at Jonathan, and he felt that familiar flutter of danger mingled with desire. They headed to a private lounge on the 20th floor to finalize terms of a major tech partnership. For an hour, their conversation remained strictly professional. Jonathan, in his element, spoke with clarity about projected revenues, market expansions, and strategic timelines. James nodded enthusiastically, scribbling notes. When the discussion ended, James's phone chimed. He apologized, explaining he needed to address an urgent matter regarding an overseas client. As James left the room, Isabella and Jonathan were suddenly alone. A weighty silence filled the plush lounge. Then Isabella leaned closer, her perfume enveloping him. "Jonathan," she said softly, "why haven't you called me back?" He shifted uncomfortably, recalling how he'd cut short their last conversation. "Work's been demanding," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Isabella reached out and rested her hand over his. "I can help take the edge off," she murmured, eyes flashing with allure. For a moment, Jonathan felt that old spark, a mixture of thrill and guilt. But now, an image of Hannah, her soulful brown eyes brimming with quiet hurt, sprang into his mind. He gently moved Isabella's hand away. "Things have changed," he said, refusing to elaborate. Isabella's confident mask slipped. She had grown accustomed to Jonathan's rapt attention. Her expression grew cold as she tried to read him. "You're not pulling away from me, are you?" He rose from his seat, feigning a check of his watch. "I have to get home," he said hastily. "Hannah's been—" He paused. He didn't want to discuss his wife, especially not with Isabella. "I'll see you at the next meeting." Without waiting for a response, he strode out of the lounge. In the elevator, he felt a knot tightening in his stomach. The moment Isabella's allure had once provided him no longer felt quite as fulfilling. It instead came with a sting of regret. Driving home, Jonathan's thoughts churned. He was in too deep. Did he truly want to unravel the marriage he had cherished for years? He arrived at the estate to find Hannah in the living room. She sat on the couch, focusing intently on her phone. A few seconds later, she rose, setting her phone aside with a composed smile. "Good evening, Jonathan," she said, voice carefully neutral. He swallowed, noticing how she no longer said, "Hey, honey," or greeted him with a hug. "How are you feeling?" he asked, heart pounding. She shrugged. "I'm fine. Just checking on some hospital records for my next prenatal appointment. They sent over details about some recommended tests." He nodded, stepping closer. "I'd like to come with you," he offered. It was a small olive branch, an attempt to connect. Hannah's eyes flickered, a trace of surprise crossing her face. "Sure," she replied, then added pointedly, "if your schedule allows." Jonathan flinched at the subtle jab, recalling how he'd missed 2 prior checkups due to urgent business. "I'll make time," he promised. Later that night, he tried to open up to her, ask about her day, her feelings, the baby, but found her responses polite yet distant. He realized with a pang that she was not going to confront him, not yet. Instead, she was merely pulling away, gradually shutting him out. Restless and unable to sleep, Jonathan wandered the house, ending up in his private study. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, biographies of self-made moguls, investment guides, and volumes on psychology and philosophy. He settled behind his oak desk, flipping through a photo album he'd once kept hidden away. Images of him and Hannah, early adventures, candle-lit dinners, seaside vacations flicked by in a bittersweet procession. His throat tightened. He couldn't help but wonder, where had they gone wrong? Was it the ceaseless pressure of success, his own insecurities? Or had the love they once shared slowly eroded beneath a sea of distractions and temptations? Without thinking, he picked up his phone. Isabella's number was still pinned near the top of his contacts. A tide of shame surged through him. He tossed the phone aside, as though it were a talisman of bad luck. He didn't realize tears were streaming down his face until they splashed onto a photograph, a snapshot of him kneeling on a sandy beach, placing a ring on Hannah's finger. The memory felt distant, almost unreal, and yet it was vivid enough to remind him what was truly at stake. The days passed in a chilly detent, with Hannah maintaining her polite, distant façade, and Jonathan growing increasingly torn between guilt and confusion. A significant turning point arrived one Thursday morning when Hannah decided it was time for a more proactive step. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of an old friend, Sarah Parker. Sarah was a quiet but insightful person who had known Hannah since high school. They had drifted apart over the years, mostly due to Hannah's hectic schedule as Jonathan's wife and now an expectant mother. But Hannah recalled Sarah's keen intuition and stable presence. When Sarah answered, Hannah spoke quietly. "I think Jonathan is involved with someone else." The words were heavy, even though she had suspected as much for weeks. Sarah listened without interrupting. When Hannah finished laying out the details, Sarah replied softly, "I'm so sorry, Hannah. Do you have any proof?" Hannah hesitated. "Nothing concrete, just phone calls, receipts, the way he's hiding things. I overheard him once, but he never knew I was there. It's only a matter of time before more evidence surfaces." Sarah sighed. "What are you planning to do?" Hannah pressed a hand over her abdomen, feeling the baby's gentle flutter. "I'm not sure. I want to confront him, but I'm afraid of the stress on my pregnancy. And I keep thinking, what if I'm overreacting? What if it's just harmless flirting?" But deep down, Hannah knew she was lying to herself. Flirting was rarely harmless, especially if it involved secret calls late at night. Sarah offered to visit that weekend, promising to lend her support. "You shouldn't be going through this alone," she said firmly. Hannah agreed, feeling a rush of gratitude. Meanwhile, Jonathan faced mounting pressure at the office. James Nicholson was urging him to finalize the merger details, while reporters were hounding him for interviews about a new venture. Amid the chaos, Isabella kept leaving voicemails and texts. Some were business-related, others far more personal. Jonathan found himself ignoring them all, uncertain what to say. One Friday afternoon, as Jonathan finished a meeting, he glanced at his phone to see a text from Isabella. "We need to talk. I miss you." He grimaced, a spike of anxiety rattling his nerves. Did he have the courage to end this? Or would he attempt to maintain the charade a while longer? He typed a brief reply. "Let's meet next week. Busy day. Sorry." He closed his phone, exhaling. The weekend was upon him, and with it, the inescapable reality of Hannah's silence. That Saturday, Sarah Parker arrived, carrying a small suitcase. Hannah welcomed her with a warm hug. Jonathan, recognizing Sarah from their wedding photos, tried to be courteous. But a prickle of tension rose when he saw the way Sarah's eyes seemed to survey his every move. Over a subdued lunch of grilled chicken and salad, Sarah tried to lighten the mood with casual conversation about old high school memories teachers they liked, embarrassing sports days, silly pranks they had pulled. Hannah smiled, but Jonathan remained distracted. Eventually, Sarah ventured, "Jonathan, how are things at the office? Hannah tells me you're working on a big merger." He nodded, swallowing a forkful of salad. "Yes, it's one of the largest projects our company has handled. Could be a massive success." Sarah's gaze was unassuming. "Must be stressful." He offered a faint shrug. "I manage." Silence. Then Sarah changed the subject, sensing how guarded Jonathan was. She made a mental note. Something felt off. Later, while Jonathan was on a conference call, Sarah and Hannah retreated to the upstairs bedroom. Hannah confided all her doubts and suspicions to her friend. Tears glistened in her eyes, though she kept her composure for the baby's sake. Sarah responded by asking a question Hannah hadn't considered thoroughly. "What do you want the outcome to be? Do you still love him enough to fight for this marriage, or are you preparing yourself to leave?" Hannah's heart twisted. She did love Jonathan, or at least she loved the man she believed he was. She recalled the night he proposed under a canopy of stars in Santorini. She remembered the letters he wrote her when she had to care for her mother in the hospital. Their love had run deep, strong enough to withstand life's storms until now. "I'm not sure," Hannah admitted. "I want this marriage to work, but I also know I can't force him to be faithful." Sarah gently squeezed her hand. "Take it one step at a time. If he's indeed cheating, he might deny it at first. You'll need to stay strong, especially for your baby." They spent the evening discussing possible scenarios. Should Hannah confront Jonathan directly, gather more evidence, or even consider leaving for a while to gather her thoughts? Downstairs, Jonathan ended his call and noticed the hush that filled the house. He glanced up the staircase, feeling a distant throb of dread. A voice inside him whispered that Hannah's friend, Sarah, had come to help Hannah make sense of his behavior. He walked to the living room, pausing at a photograph on the mantel, a snapshot of him and Hannah beaming on their honeymoon. A pang of regret coursed through him. The cracks in his marriage were widening, and he knew he was the one who'd hammered them in place. Tensions reached a new peak on Sunday morning. Hannah had planned a small brunch to show Sarah around their new home. While they arranged a tray of fresh fruits, French toast, and a pitcher of orange juice, Jonathan sat silently at the table, scrolling through emails on his phone. Sarah broke the awkward silence. "This house is lovely, Hannah. Such a beautiful view of the garden from here." Hannah forced a smile, placing the plate of toast before Sarah. "Thank you. We wanted a home with plenty of natural light. It's calming. Jonathan set his phone down, clearing his throat. "Yes, we like it here," he said. There was a flicker of sincerity in his eyes as he glanced at Hannah. It was Hannah's idea to go for a place surrounded by greenery. Sarah studied them discreetly. She noticed how Jonathan's gaze lingered on Hannah with a hint of apology in it, but Hannah rarely met his eyes. Halfway through brunch, Jonathan's phone vibrated on the table. Hannah stiffened. Sarah could see the tension in her posture. Jonathan glanced at the caller ID and quickly silenced it. A moment later, it buzzed again. This time, he grabbed the phone and stood up. "Excuse me, I need to take this," he muttered, disappearing into the hallway. A thick silence settled between the women. Hannah looked paler than before. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This keeps happening." Sarah reached across the table, covering Hannah's hand with her own. "Don't apologize. Remember, this isn't your fault." After a few minutes, Jonathan returned. He looked flustered, as though he'd been caught in a losing argument. Not meeting Hannah's eyes, he mumbled a vague apology and sank back into his chair. Sarah decided it was time to leave them alone for a bit. She announced she needed some fresh air and stepped outside to admire the garden. Jonathan watched her go, then turned to Hannah. He forced a calm tone. "Listen, Hannah, I'm sorry about that call. It was someone from the office." She inclined her head slightly. "I'm sure," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on them. Jonathan clenched his fists beneath the table, summoning courage. "Hannah, is there something bothering you?" She lifted her gaze, eyes searching his face. "Yes," she said softly, "but I don't think you're ready to hear it." A rush of panic slammed into Jonathan. He tried to regain composure. "I want to listen," he insisted, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. Hannah let out a breath. "I'm not blind, Jonathan. I know you're hiding something from me. You guard your phone like it's a state secret. You've been distant, and you keep leaving the room to take calls." "I'm pregnant, not oblivious." His heart pounded. Part of him wanted to confess, to lay bare every mistake, but fear stilled his tongue. He managed a weak denial. "It's work, Hannah. That's all." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "If it is, then why won't you let me see your phone?" "You've never been this secretive before." Jonathan stiffened, gripping his phone like a lifeline. An internal voice screamed to show her, to prove there was nothing to hide. But that would be a lie. Isabella's messages and calls were still there. He shook his head, struggling to maintain composure. Hannah's eyes flickered with hurt. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was firm. "I'm going upstairs, Jonathan." The first tired. Before she left the table, Jonathan reached out, gently clasping her wrist. "Hannah, please." I just need time." Her gaze held a quiet sadness. "Time for what?" she asked. "To decide if you still want this marriage." He had no words, only a pang of guilt deeper than any he'd felt before. Hannah pulled her wrist free and walked away. Outside, Sarah watched from the garden as Hannah crossed a hallway window on the second floor, disappearing into a room. She suspected an argument had just unfolded. The next moment, Jonathan stepped onto the porch, trying to mask his distress. Sarah turned, arms folded. "Everything okay?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jonathan paced the porch, hands shoved into his pockets. He looked like a man on the brink of confession, but too terrified to speak. "Sarah," he began haltingly, "Hannah seems upset." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "She's worried, and she's pregnant. That kind of stress is unhealthy. You need to be honest with her." Jonathan trailed off, meeting Sarah's gaze. He saw no accusation there, only concern for her friend. A wave of shame washed over him. Finally, he blurted, "I haven't been honest, but I'm afraid to lose her if I admit the truth." Sarah's shoulders sagged, as though Jonathan's admission confirmed her suspicions. "You'll lose her anyway if you keep hiding," she replied gently. His eyes flickered with anguish. I want to fix this, he whispered, barely able to hear his own words. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his rigid posture. Then act quickly, she advised. Secrets have a way of making themselves known, with or without your control. Inside, Hannah lay on her bed, one hand on her swollen belly, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She could sense the turmoil in the house, the tension swirling in her own heart. If Jonathan confessed, would she be able to forgive him? If he continued to lie, would she have the strength to walk away? In a quiet moment of resolve, she whispered to herself, I will protect you, pressing her hand gently on her unborn child. No matter what happened next, her priority was the tiny life inside her. Still, in the deepest corner of her heart, she clung to a delicate hope that Jonathan might choose the path of truth before it was too late. Monday arrived with a brisk winter chill, and the atmosphere at the White Estate matched the weather's cold edge. Sarah offered to stay for another day, but Hannah insisted she had already done enough. After an emotional farewell, Hannah thanked her, promising to call if things got worse. Jonathan drove to the office, trying to bury his guilt under a mountain of work. Just as he began sifting through spreadsheets, Isabella's number flashed on his phone. His chest tightened. He didn't want to answer, yet ignoring her calls no longer felt like an option. He stepped into a deserted conference room. Isabella, he said quietly, I'm at work. This better be important. A slight pause, then a sigh. You've been avoiding me, Isabella said. You've changed. Did something happen? Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. Things have gotten complicated at home, he admitted, choosing his words carefully. She scoffed, the sound sharp over the line. Your wife found out? His stomach lurched. No, not exactly, but she's suspicious. I can't keep doing this. Silence hung like a guillotine blade. Are you saying you want to end things between us? Isabella asked, her tone a mixture of disbelief and anger. Jonathan swallowed. I don't know. He hated how indecisive he sounded, how weak. I have to fix my marriage. She let out a cold laugh. So that's it. You used me for some fun, and now you run back to your precious wife. He bristled. It was never just fun, Isabella, but I can't lose my family. Her voice turned steely. Well, you should have thought about that before. I won't just vanish quietly. Jonathan's throat tightened. This was the moment he had feared. Isabella was not someone to cross lightly. She had her own ambitions, and he'd become entangled in her life. I'm sorry, he said, voice trembling. Sorry won't fix the damage, she shot back. I put a lot on the line for you personally and professionally. I hope you remember that. She hung up, leaving him standing alone in the empty conference room. His reflection in the glass panel showed a man suddenly aged by regret. Back at home, Hannah sat on the couch, flipping through baby name books, though her heart wasn't in it. She'd had a doctor's appointment scheduled that afternoon and fully intended for Jonathan to accompany her, as he'd promised. But a gnawing dread whispered that he might not show up. Around noon, Hannah gathered her handbag and stepped out onto the porch, heading to her car. She paused, gazing at the seat next to her empty, like the space Jonathan should occupy. A surge of resentment flared, but she tamped it down for the baby's sake and drove herself to the hospital. In the ultrasound room, Dr. Garcia greeted her warmly. Hannah, how are you feeling? She forced a small smile. I'm okay, she lied. They began the examination, the ultrasound machine's hum filling the silence. Hannah's heart swelled with emotion as the monitor revealed the faint flicker of her baby's heartbeat. It was the one miracle that no amount of marital strife could dampen. After the checkup, Dr. Garcia handed Hannah a small black and white sonogram. Everything looks good so far. We'll keep monitoring, of course, but you seem healthy. Hannah nodded, tears prickling her eyes. She wished Jonathan were there to share this moment. The absence of his warmth gnawed at her, reminding her that the life they created should be a source of unity, not isolation. When she returned home, the house was still. She set the sonogram on the kitchen counter, debating whether to text Jonathan. In the end, she simply snapped a photo of the sonogram and sent him a message. Appointment went fine. Baby is healthy. Thought you'd want to see. Hours later, Jonathan finally trudged into the house, shoulders sagging with the weight of the day. He noticed the sonogram photo on the counter and picked it up carefully. A wave of emotions surged through him: pride, amazement, and suffocating shame. Hannah stepped out of the living room. "I see you got my message." He turned, holding up the sonogram. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it. The day got away from me." Her expression remained neutral, I figured. He took a step closer, voice trembling. "Hannah, I want to be here for you, for the baby." "I'm sorry, I really am." She searched his eyes for sincerity. After a long pause, she said quietly, "Then prove it." He swallowed, nodding slowly. "I will." Just then, Hannah's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at it, her face paling. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Your husband thinks he can just walk away. We should talk." Jonathan noticed the shift in her demeanor. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then picked up the phone, reading the message again. Her heart pounded. The suspicion that it might be Isabella or someone affiliated with her hammered through her mind. She turned the screen toward Jonathan, her voice low. "Is there something you need to tell me, Jonathan?" His stomach flipped at the sight of that cryptic text. He felt the walls closing in. The time for secrets was running out, and Hannah's next reaction would determine everything: his marriage, his fatherhood, even his own sense of self. Hannah's gaze pinned Jonathan as she held out the phone. "Who would send me a message like that?" He swallowed hard, thoughts racing. Could Isabella have done this? Or was it someone else who knew about their liaison? I'm not sure," he stammered. "Maybe it's a prank." A mirthless laugh escaped her. "A prank? That's your best guess." He reached out to take the phone, but Hannah pulled it away. The text glowed ominously on the screen. "Look," Jonathan began, voice trembling. "I want to explain, but it's complicated." She set the phone down, her expression resolute. "Start with the truth." Jonathan felt cornered, heart pounding. So loudly he feared he might pass out. A memory flashed, his father once telling him, "Honesty is only easy when you've done nothing wrong. When you have something to lose, it's the hardest path." In a wavering voice, he began, "I met someone, Isabella, at a business meeting. We got involved, but it was a mistake. I swear, Hannah, it was never about replacing you. He stopped, words choked by guilt. Hannah inhaled sharply, tears threatening to break through her cold exterior. Still, she maintained composure. "How long?" He pressed a hand to his forehead. "A few months. But it was only ever an affair of phone calls. Texts, no permanent intentions." He realized how hollow his words sounded. Her eyes flashed with pain. "You think that makes it better? That it wasn't permanent?" He shook his head. "No, I'm sorry." He paused, his voice trembling. "I ended it, Hannah. At least, I tried to. She's not taking it well." Silence. Hannah's mind spun with anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of relief. At least she wasn't imagining it. "So that's who's texting me," Jonathan sighed, resignation filling him. "Likely yes. I confronted her today and told her I wanted to save my marriage." A wave of bitterness coursed through Hannah. She picked up the phone again, reading the text a second time. "Then why involve me? Is she threatening you?" He wasn't sure how to respond. "Isabella's upset and I can't predict what she'll do. Maybe she wants to scare me or you into responding." Hannah felt her baby kick, a sharp reminder that she had more to protect now than just her own heart. "What does she want?" Jonathan pressed his lips together. "I don't know, but I'm prepared to handle it. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." She closed her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. The father of her child had strayed, and now the mistress was intruding into her life. Her voice, when it emerged, was quiet and controlled. "You say you ended it. Are you absolutely sure?" He nodded vigorously. "Yes, I told her it was over. I told her I want to be with you and our child." A pause. Then Hannah turned away, tears glistening. She pressed her palm against her baby bump. "You hurt me, Jonathan. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her words sliced through him. I understand," he whispered, "but I want to try. Please, Hannah, give me a chance. I'll prove it to you." She shook her head. "Prove it how? By ignoring her calls? By blocking her number?" "This isn't just about ending an affair. It's about the damage you've done to us." Jonathan's eyes brimmed with regret. "I know, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right. Therapy, time off work, anything." Hannah took a shaky breath. "I can't even look at you right now." Her voice cracked, revealing the hurt beneath her calm exterior. "I need space." He stood there, heart hammering. "Where will you go?" She wiped away a tear. "I'll stay here in the guest bedroom for now, but I don't want you near me until I can figure out how I feel." Jonathan's shoulders sagged. "Okay, whatever you need." She turned toward the stairs, then paused. "If she contacts you again, I want to know immediately. If she comes near me or our child, I'll make sure she regrets it." He swallowed, nodding. "Agreed." Hannah ascended the stairs, leaving Jonathan alone in the dimly lit foyer. He gazed at the phone on the coffee table, the text still displayed. The power dynamic had shifted. Isabella's hold on him was replaced by Hannah's heartbreak and fury. And for the first time, he truly feared the consequences of his actions. He paced the house until midnight, restless thoughts filling every room. The more he dwelled on Hannah's wounded eyes, the more he despised himself. He was also acutely aware that Isabella might not let go easily. At last, he drifted to the master bedroom. Seeing Hannah wasn't there, he felt a pang of emptiness. The loneliness echoed in the lavish space they once shared. Their wedding photo was on the nightstand, both of them smiling, so full of promise. In a quiet moment of clarity, Jonathan sank onto the bed and buried his face in his hands. He prayed that Hannah would eventually find it in her heart to forgive him. But as he listened to the silence, broken only by the hum of the central heating, he realized forgiveness was no longer a guarantee. Over the next week, a fragile truce prevailed in the White residence. Hannah moved into the guest bedroom, maintaining minimal contact with Jonathan. They only spoke about practical matters, doctor's appointments, groceries, the house staff's schedules. Jonathan complied with her request for space, though each day apart felt like a fresh wound. In a bid to demonstrate his commitment to change, Jonathan took an indefinite leave of absence from most of his work responsibilities. He delegated tasks to his senior executives and asked James Nicholson to handle the final stages of the merger. In the interim, he stayed home, eager to repair the rift, no matter how slow the process. Despite the tension, Hannah allowed him to drive her to her next prenatal appointment. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, arms crossed over her chest. Jonathan stole glances at her, taking in the tired lines around her eyes, the tinge of sadness that wouldn't leave her face. At the hospital, Dr. Garcia met them with a warm smile. "How are we feeling today?" she asked gently. Hannah managed a small smile. "Tired, but okay." The doctor performed a routine check and handed Hannah another ultrasound photo. Jonathan stood by silently, heart pounding with a mix of awe and sorrow at the sight of the tiny life on the screen. They left the hospital without speaking much. But as Jonathan unlocked the car doors, Hannah spoke up. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. He looked at her, eyes brimming with sincerity. "I want to be here, always." Hannah glanced away, but didn't say more. The drive home was quiet, punctuated by the purr of the engine and the unspoken tension swirling between them. That evening, Jonathan prepared dinner himself, something he rarely did. He set out 2 plates of pasta and a small salad, hoping Hannah would join him at the table. But when he knocked on her guest bedroom door, she answered in a subdued tone, "I'm not hungry right now." He left her plate in the fridge, disappointment coiling in his chest. Dinner alone felt hollow, every bite tasteless. Later, he sat in the living room, flipping restlessly through channels on the massive flat-screen TV. His mind, however, was elsewhere, on Hannah's closed door, on Isabella's potential next move, on his own stupidity. Finally, a single text arrived on his phone. His heart lurched, half expecting it to be Isabella, but it was from James Nicholson, merger closing tomorrow. "Your presence would be valuable, but I understand if you can't make it. Also, I heard from Isabella she seems furious. Let me know if you need help." Jonathan sighed, typing back a reply. "I'm focusing on my wife and unborn child. Will attend the closing if Hannah is okay with it. Thanks for the heads up about Isabella." He placed the phone on the coffee table. That woman's name, once exciting, now felt like a harbinger of doom. Upstairs, Hannah lay in the guest bed, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. She paused at photos of her and Jonathan from months ago, both beaming at a friend's wedding, dancing with joy. A tear slipped down her cheek. She hated that she still loved him, hated that the betrayal tarnished everything. Her phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number. "Jonathan shouldn't ignore me. Maybe you and I should talk, woman to woman." Hannah's fingers tightened around the device. A fresh wave of anger and protectiveness surged. Enough was enough. She typed back, "Stay away from me. This is between you and Jonathan. If you threaten me or my baby, I'll handle it legally." The reply came almost instantly. "This isn't a threat, Hannah, just an invitation. Don't you want to know the real story?" Hannah's heart hammered, but she forced herself to stay calm. She stared at the screen, the question gnawing at her. Did she want to know more details? Would that bring closure or just more pain? She decided to block the number, refusing to engage further. Then, rising from the bed, she paced the room. Her thoughts wandered to possible worst-case scenarios. Isabella showing up at the house, confronting her in public, or even trying to harm her or the baby. Her maternal instincts roared to life. She grabbed her phone and typed a message to Jonathan. She texted me again. I blocked her, but I'm scared. Within seconds, Jonathan knocked on the guest bedroom door. Hannah opened it cautiously, letting him enter. His face was drawn, eyes full of concern. "What did she say?" he asked quietly. She showed him the messages. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'll handle this," he promised. Hannah let out a shaky breath, sinking onto the bed. How? What if she keeps pushing? He crouched beside her, trying to meet her gaze. "If she persists, I'll get a restraining order. I swear I won't let her come near you." Hannah studied him, unsure whether to trust his vow. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You've really ended it." He squeezed his eyes shut, remorse evident in every line of his face. "Yes, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, to prove that I'm done with her." For a fleeting moment, they sat in silence, the tension thick. Then Hannah sighed. "Jonathan, the first so angry with you, angry you lied, angry you risked our marriage. But I'm also terrified about what she might do. We both need to be careful." He gently placed a hand on her knee. She didn't move away, and he took that as a small sign of progress. "I know. Let me call James tomorrow, see if there's a legal angle we can use, or if the company can intervene somehow." Hannah nodded, tears glistening. "I can't believe this is our life now." He looked at her, heart aching. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess. I'll make it right." As he rose to leave, Hannah touched his wrist lightly. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time in days she'd shown even a hint of warmth toward him. Though the chasm between them remained, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps their fractured bond wasn't beyond repair if he could shield her from Isabella's machinations and prove himself worthy of trust once again. The following morning, Jonathan braced himself and drove into the city for the final merger meeting. He and James Nicholson convened with a team of lawyers and executives in a sleek boardroom at the Nicholson and Company headquarters. It was supposed to be a day of triumph, a culmination of months of negotiations, yet Jonathan felt only tension and dread. The signing proceeded with formalities, handshakes, and polite applause. James turned to Jonathan. "Congratulations, partner. This is the biggest deal of our careers." Jonathan managed a tight smile. "Yes. Thank you for spearheading this while I dealt with personal matters." James clasped a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "If you need anything else, just say the word." They moved to a smaller conference room for a celebratory toast. As glasses of champagne were poured, Jonathan excused himself. He felt out of place in the celebratory atmosphere. He checked his phone, relieved to see no new messages from Isabella. Just as he thought he might slip out quietly, he spotted Isabella standing in the hallway. She wore a charcoal business suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her expression was guarded, eyes flickering with resentment. Jonathan froze, debating whether to walk away. But Isabella approached, her heels clicking ominously on the polished floor. "We should talk," she said, voice clipped. He set his jaw. "About what? I already told you it's over," she scoffed. "Yes, you made that abundantly clear." She cast a sidelong glance at the closed conference room door, behind which other executives chatted. "I lost face in front of everyone, Jonathan. I invested my time, my effort." Jonathan clenched his fists. "Don't twist the narrative. We both knew this was wrong from the start. I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore." Her eyes narrowed. "You still care about that wife of yours, even though you clearly got bored enough to stray." He swallowed, guilt mingling with anger. "I was a fool, yes, but I will not throw away my marriage for a fling." Isabella's face tightened. "A fling? I opened doors for you, introduced you to influential people. Do you think I did that out of the goodness of my heart?" Jonathan's temper flared. "I never asked for those introductions in exchange for an affair." She took a step closer, her tone dropping. "Listen closely, Jonathan. I'm not some forgettable mistake. If you alienate me, you risk more than just your reputation. I can make this entire fiasco public." The threat hung in the air, cold and heavy. Jonathan's mind raced. He imagined headlines about a scandal, the toll it would take on Hannah, the further harm to his marriage. He forced himself to speak calmly. "What do you want from me? Money?" Isabella arched an eyebrow. "That would be too obvious, wouldn't it? Besides, I have plenty of my own. What I want is acknowledgement. I won't be cast aside like trash." Jonathan rubbed his temples. "I'm sorry for how things ended, but making this public will only destroy both of us." She looked away, arms crossed. "I might consider staying silent for now, but if you or your precious Hannah keep ignoring me, I won't hesitate to do what I must." His phone buzzed in his pocket, making his heart skip a beat. He ignored it, focusing on Isabella. "Stay away from Hannah," he warned, voice low. "She's innocent in all this." Isabella lifted her chin defiantly. "We'll see." With that, she spun on her heel and walked off, leaving Jonathan trembling with anger and fear. He pulled out his phone, expecting another text from her, but it was Hannah's name on the screen. A sense of relief washed over him. He quickly answered. "Hannah?" Her voice came through, tense but steady. "Hey, just checking in. Is everything okay? You said you'd call after the meeting." He glanced down the hallway where Isabella had disappeared. "It's over now." I ran into Isabella. A pause. "Did she threaten you?" Jonathan sighed. "She's angry, claims she might go public, but I'm doing everything I can to prevent that." "Are you all right?" Hannah exhaled audibly. I'm as fine as I can be. Hurry home when you're done. He nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest. I will. And Hannah, yeah? He swallowed. I love you. Another pause, longer this time. All right, Hannah finally said, voice laden with conflicting emotions. I'll see you soon. Jonathan slid the phone back into his pocket, uncertain how to interpret her response. At least she hadn't hung up on him. For the moment, he clung to that shred of hope. Returning to the conference room, he exchanged polite farewells with the gathered executives. Ignoring the quizzical looks, James shot him. Then he headed for the elevator, each step feeling like a step deeper into the labyrinth of his own making. Isabella's threat loomed like a dark cloud, but the only thing that mattered now was safeguarding his wife and unborn child, whatever the cost. Jonathan drove back from the city with a mounting sense of urgency. The possibility of a public scandal, courtesy of Isabella's fury, pressed down on him like a weight. Yet, his foremost concern was Hannah, her emotional well-being, and the baby's safety. He arrived home to find Hannah waiting in the living room. She wore a loose, comfortable dress, her hands resting atop her swollen belly. The moment he stepped inside, she straightened, eyes scanning his face. You saw her, Hannah said, more a statement than a question. Jonathan nodded, setting his briefcase down. Yes, she threatened to go public with the affair. She wants to hurt us if she doesn't feel acknowledged. A flicker of fear passed over Hannah's features. She slowly sank onto the couch, motioning for Jonathan to sit in the chair opposite her. What does that mean for us? He took a seat, trying to keep his voice steady. I can't predict her next move, but I'll consult my legal team, request an order of protection if needed. If a story breaks, I'll resign from any public-facing role. I'll do whatever it takes to minimize damage. Hannah looked down at her hands, her engagement ring glinting in the afternoon light. And what about us, Jonathan? How do we survive this? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. We see a therapist if you're willing. We rebuild trust, step by step. Or, if you need to leave me for a while, I'll understand. I don't want to lose you, Hannah, but I know I've broken something precious. A silence fell, thick with regret and longing. Finally, Hannah lifted her gaze, tears brimming. I hate that you cheated on me, but I still love the man I married. If you truly want to make amends, we need honesty, total transparency. No more secrets. He nodded earnestly. Agreed. I'll give you full access to my phone, my email, anything you want. I'll block Isabella. I'll send a final message demanding she leave us alone, and if she persists, I'll get the law involved. Hannah took a steadying breath, touching her belly. The baby's faint kick reminded her of the future she hoped for, a future with two loving parents, a stable home and happiness that once seemed guaranteed. All right, she murmured, we can try. Relief flooded Jonathan. He stood, approaching her cautiously. May I sit with you? She nodded, allowing him to settle on the couch beside her. Slowly, as though bridging a vast canyon, he reached for her hand. She let him hold it, though her grip was tentative. In a tremulous voice he said, I promise from this day forward, I'll never betray you again. I was a fool to risk what we have, and I see that now. The thrill, the escape, it meant nothing compared to you. She closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. I want to believe you, she whispered. He pressed her hand to his heart. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it. They sat there for a time, the living room silent, except for the ticking of a nearby clock. Outside, the winter sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the estate's garden. In the days that followed, Jonathan made good on his vow of transparency. He blocked Isabella's number and emailed her a final statement. Do not contact me or my wife again. I've made my choice. He alerted his legal team about the potential threat of blackmail or public scandal. Hannah agreed to start couples therapy. She told Jonathan she needed professional help to process the betrayal. He agreed wholeheartedly, making an appointment with a reputable therapist recommended by Sarah Parker. The first session was raw and painful. Hannah spoke of feeling humiliated and abandoned, while Jonathan openly admitted his insecurities, his fear of losing everything he had built. The therapist guided them toward honest communication, urging Jonathan to relinquish his phone secrets, to let Hannah see every piece of his digital footprint if she wanted. During the second session, Hannah, tears in her eyes, confessed she was terrified about bringing a child into a fragile marriage. Jonathan knelt before her, saying he would never walk away, no matter how hard it got. Meanwhile, there was no sign of Isabella, though Jonathan's lawyers warned that sometimes people waited for the perfect time to strike. Days stretched into weeks, and Hannah's belly grew. Slowly, the tension at home began to thaw. Jonathan's unwavering presence during Hannah's prenatal appointments built a small bridge of trust. And then, on a clear morning in early spring, Hannah went into labor 3 weeks before her due date. The rush to the hospital was frantic Jonathan, forgetting where he'd left his keys. Hannah breathing through waves of contraction-induced pain. In the delivery room, Jonathan clung to her hand. She gritted her teeth, tears and sweat mingling on her face. But despite the pain, she locked eyes with him, and a memory of their wedding day shimmered in both their minds. After hours of labor, a piercing cry filled the room. Jonathan was allowed to cut the umbilical cord, his hands shaking. They had a daughter, tiny, perfect. Hannah, exhausted and overwhelmed, cradled the infant against her chest. Jonathan stood by, tears of awe streaming down his face. In that moment, the heartbreak they'd endured seemed distant, overshadowed by the miracle of new life. Somewhere outside those hospital walls, Isabella's bitterness might still smolder, and the spectre of scandal could resurface at any time. But for now, all that mattered was the tiny baby girl in Hannah's arms, and the fresh chance at rebuilding a family that Jonathan vowed never to jeopardize again. Thank you for joining this emotional journey through betrayal, heartbreak, and the fragile path to redemption in Millionaire Husband. Flirts with Mistress on phone pregnant wife's cold reaction leaves him in regret. If you found yourself hooked by the twists and turns of Jonathan's downfall and Hannah's unwavering strength, we'd love for you to share your thoughts. Will they overcome past mistakes, or will Isabella's looming threats haunt them forever? Your feedback, likes, and shares help this channel grow so we can continue bringing you real-life drama fiction stories that spark emotion and reflection. If you enjoyed witnessing Hannah's resilience and Jonathan's road to repentance, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you'll never miss another intense drama. Thank you, and we look forward to sharing more unforgettable tales with you soon.